A 76-year-old man limped across a gravel parking lot with a cane in his right hand and a leather saddlebag slung over his left shoulder, and every single rider at that rally watched him like he was a lost tourist who had wandered into the wrong event. One of them, a guy in his late 30s with a chrome helmet tucked under his arm, nudged the man next to him and said, "Somebody tell Grandpa the antique show is 2 counties over." The laughter spread through the group like a brush fire. The old man didn't look up. He didn't respond. He just kept walking one deliberate step at a time toward the far end of the lot, where a machine sat alone under a canvas tarp that looked like it had survived a war, because it had. If you understand what it means to be judged before you even open your mouth, comment the word "ride" right now, and stay with me through this entire story. His name was Earl Jessup. He was born in 1949 in a town called Ridgemont in the mountains of western North Carolina, a place so small that the post office doubled as the barbershop on Tuesdays, and the church parking lot served as the high school football field on Friday nights. His father, Henry Jessup, had come back from the Second World War with a Purple Heart, a permanent limp in his left leg, and a 1942 Harley WLA military motorcycle that he had ridden across France and brought home in a crate on a transport ship. That motorcycle sat in the Jessup family barn for most of Earl's childhood, covered in a canvas tarp, smelling like old oil and distant thunder. Henry never talked about the war. He never talked about the bike. But sometimes, late in the evening, Earl would catch his father standing in the barn doorway with one hand on the seat, staring at nothing, and Earl knew better than to say a word. Earl learned to ride on that Harley before he learned to drive a car. By the time he was 14, he could tear through the mountain switchbacks behind the family property at speeds that would have given his mother a heart attack if she had known. Henry never stopped him. Henry would sit on the porch, watching the dust trail curl up from the ridge, and he would nod once, very slowly, and that was all the approval Earl ever needed. The mountains taught Earl things that flat roads could never teach. They taught him how to read a curve by the way the trees leaned. They taught him how to feel the grade of a slope through the handlebars before his eyes could even register the change. They taught him that speed was not about the throttle. It was about trust. Trust in the machine, trust in the road, trust in yourself. And by the time Earl was 17, there was not a single rider in 3 counties who could keep up with him on those mountain roads, not on any machine, not at any speed. Then the war came for Earl the same way it came for his father. In 1968, Earl enlisted in the United States Army. He did not wait to be drafted. He walked into the recruiting office in Asheville the morning after his 19th birthday and signed his name on the line. They sent him to Fort Bragg for basic training, and after that to a place that would change the direction of his life in ways he could not have imagined. Earl was assigned to a special reconnaissance unit that operated deep behind enemy lines in Vietnam. The unit was small, it was fast, and it relied on motorcycles, modified military bikes stripped down for speed and silence, to move through terrain that no jeep or truck could navigate. Earl's mountain riding, those years of tearing through switchbacks and gravel roads and blind curves in the dark with nothing but instinct and the sound of the engine, turned out to be exactly the skill set that the army needed for missions that most soldiers never heard about and that the public would not learn of for decades. He ran point-on-night operations through jungle trails so narrow that a single mistake, a single misjudged turn, would have sent him and the bike off a cliff or straight into an ambush. He carried intelligence. He carried wounded men strapped to the back of the bike. He carried things he would never talk about. Earl served 3 tours. He was wounded twice. He received a Silver Star, a Bronze Star with Valor, and a commendation from a general whose name was still classified when Earl came home in 1972. And when he came home, he did exactly what his father had done. He parked the family Harley in the barn. He covered it with the same canvas tarp. And he did not talk about it. Not to his wife, Margaret, who he married in 1973. Not to his 2 sons, who grew up knowing their father had served but never knowing the details. Not to anyone. Earl took a job at the lumber mill outside Ridgemont. He worked there for 31 years. He coached Little League for 12 seasons. He served as a volunteer firefighter for 2 decades. He went to church on Sundays and sat in the same pew his family had sat in since 1926. And every now and then, late in the evening, Margaret would find him standing in the barn doorway with one hand on the seat of that old Harley, staring at nothing, and she knew better than to say a word. The years did what years do. They took things from Earl, one piece at a time. Margaret passed in 2014 after 41 years of marriage, and something in Earl went quiet after that, quieter than he had ever been. His left knee, injured in a fall during his second tour, finally gave out completely, and the doctors gave him a cane and told him that was the best they could do. His sons moved away, one to Charlotte, one to Atlanta, and they called every Sunday. But the calls got shorter as the years went on, the way they always do. Earl sold the house. He moved into a small apartment above a hardware store in Ridgemont. And the Harley stayed in a rented storage unit at the edge of town, untouched, unridden, the canvas tarp collecting dust the same way it had for decades. Then one morning in October of 2024, Earl's neighbour, a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy Crane, knocked on his door and handed him a flyer. It was an advertisement for the Blue Ridge Military Heritage Rally, a 2-day event held every fall at a campground and riding course in the mountains about 40 miles from Ridgemont. The rally was open to anyone who owned or had restored a military vehicle: jeeps, trucks, motorcycles, anything with a military history. There was a display competition, a parade route through the nearby town, and on the second day, a timed mountain run on a winding 12-mile course through the Blue Ridge passes. Dorothy had heard about it from her nephew, who restored vintage jeeps. She thought Earl might enjoy seeing the vehicles, maybe talking to some other veterans. Earl looked at the flyer for a long time. He looked at the photograph of the mountain road on the front, and for the first time in years, something shifted behind his eyes, something that Margaret would have recognized immediately, something that his father would have understood without a single word. Earl spent the next 3 weeks in that storage unit. He pulled the tarp off the Harley for the first time in over a decade. The bike looked exactly the way you would expect a machine from 1942 to look after 82 years of existence. The olive drab paint was faded and chipped. The leather seat was cracked in 3 places. The chrome was dull and spotted with surface rust. The tyres were old but had been stored properly, and when Earl checked the pressure, they held. He went through the engine piece by piece, the way his father had taught him, the way the army had trained him, with patience and precision, and the understanding that a machine will tell you everything you need to know if you have the sense to listen. He changed the oil. He cleaned the carburetor. He checked the valves, the timing chain, the spark plugs. He adjusted the clutch cable. He rebuilt the magneto ignition with parts he ordered from a specialty shop in Tennessee. And on the 14th day, he sat on that bike in the storage unit, kicked the starter once, and the engine roared to life with a sound that filled the concrete space like rolling thunder. And Earl closed his eyes and sat there for a full minute, just listening, just feeling the vibration through his hands and his chest, and he smiled for the first time in a very long time. The morning of the rally was cold and clear, the kind of October morning in the mountains where the sky is so blue it looks painted, and the air tastes like wood smoke and fallen leaves. Earl loaded the Harley into the bed of his old pickup truck and drove the 40 miles to the campground. He arrived early, before most of the other participants, and he unloaded the bike by himself, using a set of wooden ramps he'd built in the storage unit. It took him a while. The cane made things slower, but he managed. He always managed. He strapped the cane to the leather saddlebag on the right side of the bike, the way he used to strap his rifle during night operations, tight and secure and within reach. Then he wheeled the Harley to his assigned spot in the rally staging area and sat down on a folding chair beside it to wait. The staging area filled up over the next 2 hours. There were restored Willys Jeeps painted in fresh olive drab. There were deuce-and-a-half trucks with gleaming canvas tops. There were modern military-style motorcycles, custom builds with matte black paint and tactical accessories. And there were the riders. Mostly men in their 30s and 40s, some in their 50s. Many were veterans themselves, but the younger ones were the loudest, the most visible, the ones who had spent serious money on their machines and wanted everyone to know it. They wore expensive riding gear, armoured jackets, boots that cost more than Earl's monthly rent, helmets with custom paint jobs and Bluetooth communication systems. Their motorcycles gleamed, their chrome shone, their engines were tuned to a precision that spoke of professional shops and unlimited budgets. Earl sat in his folding chair in his worn denim jacket, a flannel shirt underneath, a pair of old boots that he had owned since the 80s, and a plain black helmet that he had bought at a garage sale in 2009. The Harley sat beside him, looking like a museum piece that had escaped its display case and wandered into the wrong century. The contrast was immediate, and the attention was not the kind Earl would have wanted. A group of 4 riders walked past Earl's spot on their way to the registration tent. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s named Kyle Brennan, rode a restored Indian chief that had been featured in 2 motorcycle magazines. Kyle had won the mountain run at this rally for 2 years running. He was loud, he was confident, and he had a habit of sizing up every other rider in any room he entered the way a predator sizes up prey. Kyle stopped when he saw the Harley. He tilted his head. He looked at the cracked seat, the faded paint, the surface rust, the old leather saddlebags. Then he looked at Earl, the white hair, the weathered face, the cane strapped to the bike, the hands resting on his knees spotted with age. Kyle grinned. He turned to the 3 men behind him, Ricky Talbot, Marco Vance, and a younger rider named Shane Durrett, and said, loud enough for Earl and everyone within 30 feet to hear, "Now that is either the bravest entry I've ever seen or the saddest. Somebody should check if he's got a medical alert bracelet before they let him on the course." The laughter was immediate. Ricky snorted. Marco shook his head with a smirk. Shane, who was 28 and had been riding for exactly 4 years, pointed at the Harley and said, "Does that thing even run? It looks like somebody dug it up." More laughter. Earl looked up at them. His expression did not change. His eyes, pale blue and deeply set beneath heavy brows, moved from face to face with the slow, measured attention of a man who had spent decades observing people in situations far more dangerous than a parking lot. He did not speak. He simply looked at them, and then he looked back at his bike, and that was the end of it. Kyle shrugged, said, "Good luck out there, old-timer," with a tone that made it clear he meant the opposite, and the group moved on. But the comments did not stop with Kyle's group. Over the next hour, as more riders arrived and walked through the staging area, the Harley drew attention the way a scar draws fingers. People stopped. People stared. Some of them were respectful. A few of the older attendees, men in their 60s and 70s, recognized the WLA model and nodded with appreciation. One man, a retired Marine named Gus Patterson, stopped and asked Earl if the bike was original. Earl said, "Every bolt." Gus looked at him for a moment, then said, "That's something," and walked away with a look on his face that suggested he understood more than he was saying. But the younger riders, the ones with the gleaming machines and the expensive gear, they were less generous. A pair of them took a photograph of the Harley and posted it to a social media group with the caption, "Somebody brought a relic to the rally, and I don't mean the bike." It got 47 laughs in 20 minutes. Another rider walking past with his girlfriend said, just loud enough, "I hope he's got good insurance, that thing's going to shake itself apart on the first curve." Earl heard every word. He heard all of it. He sat in his folding chair with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the mountains, and he did not say a word because Earl Jessup had spent his entire life being underestimated by people who mistook silence for weakness and age for inability, and he had learned a long time ago that the best response to a fool was no response at all. The first day of the rally was the vehicle display and the parade route through the nearby town. Earl rode the Harley in the parade, keeping to the back of the formation, the engine rumbling with that distinctive WLA flathead sound that was deeper and rougher than anything else on the road. People along the parade route waved, children pointed, and a few of the older spectators, men and women in their 70s and 80s, stood a little straighter when they saw that bike, because they recognized it. Not just the model, but what it meant, what it represented, what it had survived. Earl rode with his back straight and his eyes forward, the way he had been taught, the way he had always ridden, and for those 12 minutes on the parade route, with the mountain air in his face and the engine vibrating through his bones, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like himself. That evening, the rally organisers held a barbecue at the campground. Earl ate alone at a picnic table at the edge of the gathering, a plate of pulled pork and coleslaw in front of him, his cane leaning against the bench beside him. The socialising happened around him, but not with him. He was invisible in the way that old people are often invisible in crowds of younger strangers, present but unacknowledged, occupying space without occupying attention. He did not mind. He had spent most of his life comfortable with solitude, but he noticed the way Kyle Brennan held court at the centre of the largest group, talking loudly about his previous wins, about the modifications he had made to his Indian chief, about his strategy for the mountain run the next morning. Kyle was already celebrating a victory he had not yet earned, and the men around him were already confirming it with their laughter and their nodding, and Earl watched this from his picnic table at the edge of the light and said nothing. The mountain run began at 9 o'clock the next morning. The course was 12 miles of mountain road, switchbacks, elevation changes, gravel sections, 2 hairpin turns, and a steep descent through a forested valley that the organisers had nicknamed the Chute, because it was narrow and fast and unforgiving. The run was timed individually. Each rider went out alone, and their time was recorded by electronic checkpoints at the start and finish. There were safety marshals at 4 points along the course, and the rules were clear. No reckless riding, no passing if you caught a slower rider, which was unlikely given the individual start times, and helmets were mandatory. The course was not a race in the traditional sense, it was a timed challenge. But everyone there understood what it really was. It was a competition, and Kyle Brennan intended to win it for the 3rd year in a row. The starting order was determined by registration number. Kyle drew number 7. Earl drew number 23. This meant Earl would ride the course well after Kyle had already finished, which suited Kyle perfectly because it meant everyone would already know his time when the old man on the antique bike finally limped across the start line. The morning air was cold enough to see breath. The sky was the same impossible blue it had been the day before. The mountains rose on every side, hardwood forests blazing with October colour, red and gold and orange against the dark green of the evergreens on the higher ridges. The starting area was at the base of the course, a flat gravel pull-out where riders lined up, and the electronic timing system blinked green when it was time to go. There was a small crowd of spectators, other rally participants, family members, a few local enthusiasts who came every year to watch. Kyle went out 7th. He disappeared up the mountain road on his Indian chief with the throttle wide open and the engine screaming, and the spectators cheered, and the other riders shook their heads with respect and envy. Kyle was fast. Everyone knew Kyle was fast. His reputation was earned, and his machine was built for exactly this kind of riding. When his time came through on the electronic board 14 minutes and 12 seconds later, it was the fastest of the day so far, and the crowd reacted accordingly. Kyle rolled back to the staging area with his helmet off and his arms wide, accepting congratulations as if the trophy were already in his hands. The riders went out one by one. Number 8, number 9, number 12. None of them came close to Kyle's time. A few were within a minute. Most were 2 or 3 minutes behind. The crowd began to settle into the comfortable assumption that the outcome was decided. Kyle stood near the timing board, watching each number come in, his arms crossed, his expression carrying that particular kind of satisfaction that belongs to people who have not yet learned the difference between confidence and arrogance. Number 23 was called at 10:47 in the morning. Earl walked to the starting line with his cane, the gravel crunching under his boots. The spectators watched him the way people watch something they do not quite understand, with curiosity, with pity, with a vague discomfort that comes from not knowing whether to offer help or look away. Earl reached the Harley, which was already positioned at the start line. He strapped the cane to the saddlebag with practiced efficiency. He pulled on his plain black helmet. He swung his leg over the seat with a deliberate motion that showed both pain and determination. He settled his weight. He gripped the handlebars, and then he kicked the starter once, one sharp downward strike, and the WLA engine exploded to life on the first try with a sound that silenced every conversation within 50 yards. It was not the polished purr of a modern engine, it was a roar. A deep, raw, mechanical roar that came from another era. From a machine that was built not for comfort or style, but for war. And in that sound was something that made several people in the crowd take an involuntary step back. Kyle looked over from the timing board. He was smiling. He nudged Ricky and said something that made Ricky laugh. They expected entertainment. They expected to watch an old man on an old bike struggle through a mountain course and limp home with a time that would be twice as long as everyone else's. They expected exactly what people always expect when they see someone who does not look the part. The timing light turned green. Earl twisted the throttle, and the Harley WLA leapt forward like a thing unleashed, the rear tyre biting into the gravel, the engine screaming, and Earl Jessup disappeared up that mountain road with a speed and a violence that turned every head in the staging area. There was a moment of pure silence, and then someone said, very quietly, "What the hell?" The course had 5 electronic checkpoints. The first was at the 2-mile mark, at the base of the first major switchback section. Earl's time came through, and the marshal at the checkpoint radioed it down to the staging area, and the number that appeared on the board made Kyle Brennan stop talking mid-sentence. Earl was running 2 seconds faster than Kyle's pace at the same checkpoint. It was a small margin. It could have been a fluke. It could have been the result of a reckless launch that would cost the old man time on the technical sections ahead. Kyle told himself that. He told Ricky that. He told himself again, but something in his chest had tightened, and he could not quite explain why. The second checkpoint was at the 4-mile mark, at the top of the switchback section, and when Earl's time came through, the margin had grown to 6 seconds. Not a fluke. Not a reckless pace that would burn out. 6 seconds faster on the most technical section of the course, the section that separated real riders from weekend enthusiasts. The crowd had gone quiet. People were looking at the timing board with expressions that mixed confusion with something else, something that looked very much like the beginning of awe. The third checkpoint was at the 7-mile mark, just before the entrance to the chute. Earl's margin was now 11 seconds, 11 seconds faster than Kyle Brennan on a machine that was 82 years old, a machine with no modern suspension, no electronic fuel injection, no traction control, no anti-lock brakes, nothing but a flathead engine and a rigid frame, and the hands of a man who had learned to ride these mountains before most of the people in that crowd were born. The murmuring started. People were looking at each other. People were looking at Kyle, and Kyle was not talking anymore. Kyle was standing very still, his arms no longer crossed, his eyes fixed on the timing board with an expression that had shifted from amusement to disbelief to something that looked very much like fear. Not fear of losing a trophy. Fear of being wrong. Fear of having misjudged something so completely that the foundation of his own confidence had cracked. The fourth checkpoint was at the 10-mile mark, at the bottom of the chute, and when Earl's time came through, the staging area erupted. Not in cheers, not in something more complicated than cheers, in a sound that was part gasp, part exclamation, part laughter, part disbelief. Earl was now 17 seconds ahead of Kyle's pace. 17 seconds on a 12-mile mountain course was not a victory. It was a demolition. It was the kind of margin that separated amateurs from professionals, hobbyists from athletes, riders from something else entirely. People were pulling out their phones. People were filming the timing board. Someone said, "Who is that guy?" And no one had an answer. And then Earl came around the final bend. The last 2 miles of the course were a long sweeping descent through open meadow, with a view of the valley below, and the spectators at the finish line could see the riders coming for the last quarter mile. They saw the Harley first, that unmistakable silhouette, the olive drab paint, the upright riding position, the rigid frame, the sound, that deep raw thundering sound that had no business being as fast as it was. Earl came down that final stretch with the throttle open and his body low over the handlebars, not crouching the way a modern sport rider would, but leaning forward with a posture that spoke of thousands of hours on that exact machine, a posture that was not learned from a book or a video but earned mile by mile on mountain roads in darkness and in danger. And the Harley ate the road beneath him like it was hungry for it, like it had been waiting decades for this, like the machine itself had been holding its breath in that storage unit for all those years, and was finally exhaling. Earl crossed the finish line. The electronic timer stopped. The number appeared on the board. 13 minutes and 41 seconds. 31 seconds faster than Kyle Brennan, on an 82-year-old motorcycle, with a cane strapped to the saddlebag. The crowd did not know how to react at first. There was a beat of silence, the kind of silence that happens when reality collides with expectation, so violently that the brain needs a moment to reorganize itself. And then the cheering started. It started with the older men, the veterans, the ones who had been watching quietly all weekend. Gus Patterson, the retired Marine who had admired the bike the day before, was the first to clap. Then the woman standing next to him, then a group of spectators near the finish banner, and then it spread, fast and loud and genuine, the kind of applause that is not about politeness but about recognition, about witnessing something that does not happen every day, something that reminds you that the world is bigger and stranger and more remarkable than you usually allow yourself to believe. Earl rolled the Harley to a stop near the staging area. He killed the engine. He sat on the bike for a moment, both hands on the handlebars, his chest rising and falling with heavy breath, his face flushed from the cold and the speed and something else, something that had nothing to do with the rally and everything to do with a storage unit and a canvas tarp and a lifetime of silence. Then he unstrapped his cane from the saddlebag, swung his leg off the bike with that same deliberate, painful motion, and stood there, leaning on the cane, looking at the mountains. Kyle Brennan did not move for a long time. He stood by the timing board with his arms at his side, staring at the number, and the men who had been standing around him, congratulating him, confirming his greatness, had all taken a step back, the way people do when the person they have been orbiting suddenly loses their gravitational pull. Kyle's face went through several phases: disbelief, frustration, and then, slowly, something else. Something that looked like the first faint crack of humility breaking through a wall that had been built over years of being the fastest, the best, the one who never lost. He looked at Earl. He looked at the Harley. He looked at the number on the board again. And then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. Kyle walked over to Earl. He walked slowly, deliberately, the way a man walks when he is carrying something heavy that no one else can see. He stopped about 5 feet from the old man and stood there for a moment, and Earl looked at him with those pale blue eyes, and neither of them spoke. Then Kyle said, very quietly, "Where did you learn to ride like that?" It was not a challenge. It was not sarcasm. It was a genuine question from a man who had just been shown the limits of his own understanding. Earl looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "My father taught me on these mountains when I was 14 years old. The United States Army taught me the rest." Kyle blinked. He looked at the Harley again, really looked at it this time, and something in his expression changed as the details began to register in a way they had not before. The military paint, the star on the tank, faded but visible, the saddlebag hardware that was not decorative but functional, the lack of ornamentation, the stripped-down purposefulness of a machine that was built for a specific job in a specific war. Kyle swallowed. He said, "You served?" Earl said, 3 tours, Vietnam, 68 to 72. Kyle's mouth opened slightly. He looked at the cane. He looked at Earl's hands, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the fingers that had just guided an 82-year-old motorcycle through a mountain course faster than anyone else at the rally. And then Kyle said something that he had never said to another rider in his life. He said, "I'm sorry for what I said yesterday. That was wrong." Earl studied him. There was no anger in his face. There was no satisfaction, no triumph, no vindication. There was only the calm, measured expression of a man who had heard worse things in worse places and who had long ago stopped keeping score. Earl nodded once and said, "Takes a bigger man to say that than it does to ride that course. You're all right." The rally organizer, a retired Army colonel named David Chen, had been watching from the timing station. Colonel Chen had organized this rally for 11 years. He had seen fast riders. He had seen impressive machines. He had never seen anything like what he had just witnessed. He walked over to Earl with a deliberate stride that carried the unmistakable bearing of a career military officer. Spine straight, shoulders square, chin level. He stopped in front of Earl and said, "Mr. Jessup, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. That bike, that time, that riding. I've been around military motorcycles my entire career. What unit were you with?" The staging area had gone quiet again. People had gathered, phones were out. Kyle stood to the side, watching. Earl looked at Colonel Chen, and for the first time all weekend, something shifted in his expression. The mask of quiet indifference softened. The wall that he had built around his past, the same wall his father had built, the wall that men of their generation constructed out of silence and duty, and the belief that service spoke for itself, that wall developed a crack. Earl reached into the inside pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out a small worn leather case. He opened it. Inside was a military identification card, old and laminated, the photograph showing a young man with sharp eyes and a jawline that could cut glass, wearing the insignia of a unit that Colonel Chen recognized immediately. Colonel Chen's posture changed. His spine, already straight, went rigid. His eyes widened. He looked at the card, then at Earl, then at the card again. He said very quietly, "You were with the 75th. It was not a question. Earl said, "I was." Colonel Chen looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "The 75th Ranger Regiment. Long-range reconnaissance. Motorcycle scouts." Earl nodded. Colonel Chen's voice dropped even further. "I've read about your unit. The night operations, the trail runs, the intelligence extractions. Most of those missions are still classified. Your unit ran motorcycles through terrain that would have stopped a vehicle convoy, at night, under fire. Earl said nothing. He did not need to. The card in his hand said everything, and the time on the board confirmed it. Colonel Chen turned to the crowd. His voice carried the way a command carries, clear and certain and impossible to ignore. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this man served with one of the most elite and least-known reconnaissance units in the history of the United States military. The motorcycle scouts of the 75th Ranger Regiment ran missions in Vietnam that most of us cannot imagine, and that many of the men who ran them did not survive. They rode through enemy territory in darkness, on machines not very different from the one sitting behind me, at speeds and in conditions that would test the limits of any rider alive. And this man right here, just demonstrated on our mountain course exactly why those men were selected for that duty." He paused. He looked at Earl, and then Colonel David Chen, retired United States Army, did something that no one in that crowd expected. He came to attention, full attention, heels together, arms at his sides, chin up, and he saluted. The silence was absolute. It lasted 2 seconds, 3. And then Gus Patterson, the retired Marine, came to attention and saluted. And then another man, and then another. And then, one by one, every veteran in that crowd snapped to attention and rendered a salute to a 76-year-old man leaning on a cane next to a rusty 1942 Harley WLA that had crossed France in a war and crossed a mountain in a rally, and had never once in 82 years failed to start on the first kick. Earl stood there. He did not move. His chin trembled once, very slightly, and his eyes glistened, but he held himself the way he had always held himself, upright, steady, quiet. He looked at the men and women saluting him, and he looked at the mountains behind them, and he raised his right hand slowly and returned the salute with a precision that had not faded in over 50 years. Kyle Brennan watched this. He was not a veteran. He had never served. But he understood what he was seeing even if he could not fully articulate it. He understood that he was standing in the presence of something that transcended trophies and timing boards and chrome helmets. He understood that the man he had mocked the day before had earned his place on that mountain road in a way that Kyle's money and his modifications and his 2 previous wins could never match. And when the salutes ended and the crowd began to move again, Kyle walked back to Earl one more time. He extended his hand. Earl took it. They shook once, firm and brief. Kyle said, "It was an honour to ride the same course as you, sir," and he meant it. The rally continued for the rest of the afternoon. Earl won the timed mountain run. He also won the Vehicle Display Award in the military motorcycle category, which had been voted on by the attendees the previous day but had not been announced until the closing ceremony. When Colonel Chen handed him the trophy, a simple wooden plaque with a brass plate engraved with the rally name and the year, Earl looked at it for a moment, then looked at the colonel and said, "My father would have liked this." Colonel Chen said, "I think your father would have been proud, Mr. Jessup." Earl said, "He never needed trophies. Neither do I, but I'll put it next to his." And that was the only time during the entire weekend that Earl Jessup's voice cracked. The story spread. Of course it spread. In the age of phones and social media, and the insatiable appetite for stories that remind people that the world is not entirely predictable, the story of the 76-year-old man on the rusty Harley who smoked every rider at the Blue Ridge Military Heritage Rally spread like wildfire. The video that one of the spectators filmed of Earl crossing the finish line, the Harley roaring, the crowd erupting, the old man sitting upright on that ancient machine like he was born on it, was viewed over 2 million times in the first week. News outlets picked it up. A reporter from a regional television station drove to Ridgemont and knocked on Earl's door. Earl let her in. He made her coffee. He answered 3 questions, politely and briefly, and then he said he had said all he cared to say, and she respected that, and she wrote a story that was honest and restrained and captured something about Earl that the viral video could not. Kyle Brennan posted a public statement on his social media account. He described what had happened. He described what he had said to Earl on the first day. He did not make excuses. He did not soften it. He wrote simply that he had been arrogant and wrong, that a man he had dismissed had taught him a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life, and that if you ever get the chance to shut your mouth and watch someone who has earned their skill through decades of sacrifice, you should take that chance, because you might just see something that changes the way you understand the world. The post was shared 11,000 times. Ricky Talbot and Shane Durrett both reached out to Earl separately. Ricky sent a handwritten letter, an actual letter, on paper, mailed with a stamp, apologising for his part in the mockery and asking if Earl would be willing to teach him about the WLA model. Earl wrote back a one-line response. "Come to Ridgemont, bring coffee, I'll show you the bike." Shane drove up from South Carolina the following month and spent an afternoon in Earl's storage unit, listening to the old man explain the flathead engine with the patience and precision of a master mechanic. And when Shane left, he sat in his truck for 10 minutes before driving away because he needed to collect himself. Earl returned to the rally the following year. He rode the mountain run again. His time was slower, 13 minutes and 58 seconds, because the knee was worse and the cold was harder on his hands. He finished 4th. He did not care. What he cared about was the moment at the starting line when he kicked the engine alive on the first try and heard that sound, that deep, raw, thundering sound, and felt the vibration in his hands and his chest and his bones, and looked up at the mountains that had taught him everything he knew, and knew that his father was somewhere in that sound, and Margaret was somewhere in that wind, and the men he had ridden with in the darkness of a war that never ended for any of them were somewhere in the road ahead, and all he had to do was open the throttle and go. The plaque from the first rally sits on a shelf in Earl's apartment above the hardware store in Ridgemont. Next to it is his father's Purple Heart. Next to that is a photograph from 1970, black and white, showing a young man in fatigues sitting on a motorcycle at the edge of a jungle, looking at the camera with the kind of expression that only belongs to people who have been somewhere that most people will never go and have come back carrying something that most people will never understand. The cane leans against the wall beside the shelf. The Harley sits in the storage unit, the canvas tarp pulled back, the engine clean, ready. Always ready. Some stories are about winning. This one is not. This story is about what happens when you look at a person and think you know everything you need to know based on what you can see. The white hair, the cane, the rust, the age. And then you discover that what you can see is the smallest, least important part of who that person is. It is about the fact that silence is not emptiness, that age is not weakness, that a rusty machine with the right hands on the handlebars will outrun a polished one every single time, and it is about a 76-year-old man who strapped his cane to a saddlebag, kicked an engine to life, and reminded every person on that mountain that respect is not given based on appearances. It is earned, mile by mile, year by year. And sometimes, when the moment is right, it is proven beyond any possible doubt on a 12-mile stretch of mountain road, with the whole world watching. If this story reminded you that every person you meet is carrying a story you do not know, subscribe to this channel. We find the people the world overlooks, and we tell the stories the world needs to hear. Share this with someone who respects those who served, and if you have a veteran in your life who deserves to be seen, comment their name below, because they are watching, and they need to know that their sacrifice was not forgotten.